Entrepreneur Society. And I have a few announcements to start off with. We have some exciting things going on. I want to make sure, particularly for entrepreneurs, that you know of some things coming down the pike here. So, first of all, most of you know about our Georgia Technology Summit. It's February 28th this year at Cobb Galleria. We have a great lineup, including Rich DeMillo, who is the Dean of Computing with Georgia Tech. He also was the past CTO of Hewlett-Packard. We have Jim Blanchard, who many of you know from Synovus, retiring chair of Synovus. And our featured speaker is Chris Anderson. Chris is the managing editor of Wired Magazine. He just wrote a book, which I'm in the middle of now, called The Long Tail. It's one of the top business books for 2006. So we're excited to have him. We also have the top 40 innovative company competition. So if you're a company that is in Georgia that might be interested in exploring applying for that award, it's a great opportunity because you get an exhibit table, and if you're in the top 10, you get a chance to present for 3 minutes before a crowd of what we expect to be about 800 people. The second thing, we have flyers out here. If you're a new company that happens to be in financial technologies or supply chain technologies, we have the business launch competition where we give away $100,000 in cash and $150,000 in services. This is the second year we're doing it. The first company that we had on board was ReachMD and out of Augusta, and they're actually doing a fine job with lots of progress in their business. The next Entrepreneurial Society meeting will be on February 1st, and Jim Boone's going to lead that. He's managing partner of Winship Partners, and he conducted over 300 successful search assignments. He's put a great panel together, so it'll be interesting. He's got Wayne Kellum, who's President and CEO of Trusted Network Technologies, Michael Kosdorf, President and CEO of Ardent, and Joseph Giuliano, who's CEO of Prime Revenue. And so that's February 1st, first Thursday in February. ATDC has an event coming up on January 25th called Preparing for the M&A Exit, and it's going to be at TSRB. You'll hear more information on that. And before we get Marc started and sort of run a little bit late, I just want to introduce Angus McCrae. Angus is with Angus McCrae Insurance Brokerage Services, and he's the sponsor for today. So,
yes, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for allowing us to be the sponsor. When I was first meeting with Kino, kind of getting started, I said, I'm very, very disappointed in TAG for one reason, and that's that we don't have some of these, 1970-looking Bill Gates types here, beards and having faith and what have you. So hopefully that'll change. But we do employee benefits for small and medium-sized employers. If anybody needs any numbers as you're writing a business plan, I'd be happy to help out. We basically try and take a group from the founding stage up through that hyper growth, and then they get bought out from under us and lose a client. So that's the end game of it all. So anyway, anything we can do to help you.
Thanks, Angus. And now it's my privilege to introduce Marc. Marc is on our board, and he has a very interesting past, like many entrepreneurs. His background includes being a French paratrooper, receiving a master's degree in theoretical physics. Marc went on to earn his doctorate and become a visiting scientist at MIT while working on his PhD thesis. He began his career in sales at Sun Micro in France, and then moved to the U.S. and worked early on Java development, SAP, and SAP Labs. Marc had an idea to promote and accelerate the adoption of open source and started JBoss. The company, as I understand it, started in a room in his in-laws. I know Sophie, his mother-in-law, here in Atlanta. And the JBoss application server was first released in 1999. And in 2006, JBoss was sold to Red Hat for $350 million, making Red Hat the industry's largest independent open source provider. So with that, Marc Fleury. Thanks.
following on your comment, the only thing that's true this morning is I have not bathed. So I want to apologize for that. I want to apologize for being late. We have 4 kids at home. It was a hectic night, and I slept right through my alarm clock. Actually, that's not true. This genius here with the PhD and difficult stuff couldn't figure out his own alarm clock, so I apologize for being late this morning.
We're going to continue to disrupt you, but you might not.
That's all right.
Dual mics. There you go.
So I apologize for this, and let's get started right away. So the topic this morning is to talk a little bit about the sales process of JBoss and how it went, and sort of what led to that and how we went through that. It's interesting for those of you that have been through that experience. It's a very hectic experience, and we were reminiscing with my wife yesterday that in fact it's about 1 year from when all this craziness started. And just for full disclosure, I ended up in various emergency rooms with my nurse, completely shot through the process. So it's a bit of a hectic thing and something to be dealt with very carefully. So I'll talk about that, but I'll first start by talking about what led to the decision to sell. This information is obviously very context dependent. It depends on what you do, what type of company you have, and what the markets, the public markets, for example, are at a given point in time. But for us, as I'm sure for many of you, it started by a simple decision of not really simple, but by a calculation of net present value to our shareholders. As chairmen of your company, your fiduciary duty is to maximize that present economic value to your shareholders. And so, as board members, we went through a lot of exercises of, are we maximizing the present value by selling now, or are we maximizing the net present value of a future IPO if we were to go IPO? The public markets are very, very difficult for young companies nowadays. Sarbanes-Oxley, since I have the podium, I'll rant a little bit about Sarbanes-Oxley. The pendulum has swung a little bit too far. The constraints placed on small companies from a reporting standpoint and the amount of money it costs to be compliant are fairly stringent and very imposing. We're talking about a couple of $1 million. When you have a company that is based on cash flow, obviously it depends on what type of company you have, but for subscription-based companies, we're dealing with cash flow-based valuation. A $2 million cash flow hit is a significant valuation hit. In discussing, in speaking about this at various industry events, I was in Boston about 2 months ago at a VC and bankers event, and it keeps coming up that Sarbanes-Oxley is a problem, that it was done as a knee-jerk reaction more than a really thought-out answer to basically what is extreme corruption by some of corporate America. We're all paying the price, in a sense, for the sins of a few. And that is unfortunate, but that is the way it is. That is the way it is. So Sarbanes-Oxley is a problem, and all the, not so much the law itself, the letter of the law itself, but much more the spirit around it and how investors today deal with young companies. It's a tough market. There's a lot of companies going public, obviously. So it's still something you can do, and I encourage you to evaluate those the public option with great care. I picked up in those events apparently a trend that is growing in popularity, and that is to go, and if your need is more that of raising money as opposed to liquidity, then apparently the London Stock Exchange, which is a budding place for young companies, may be a very attractive solution compared to the American public markets, such as NASDAQ. because it's less stringent. There is American investors claim there is not as much liquidity in the London Stock Exchange. Maybe I'm confused with the name. It's a London place, but that's there for you. I've heard of other people going public in Dubai. Don't smile. Money is money, and been very successful with this. Specifically, an Indian company with operations in the U.S. That decided for liquidity purposes to go to the Dubai marketplace. Bottom line, there's a few options available to you, and even though it's a difficult time to go public and a very stringent process to go through, it's still a very attractive option. Let me talk a little bit about what let's assume that you have equivalents of their present value. Let's assume that you decide that we may sell today for X, or we may sell in 2 years for 7X, whatever the rate of compounding is. What are the questions coming into play as you go through the decision to sell your company versus IPO? Of course, the obvious of, do you have buyers? Let's come back to that in a second and how you go about that. But let's compare. I'll describe what some of the things that went through our board and our minds as we were discussing this. The most obvious one is that of liquidity. An IPO is a partial liquidity. You're locked up. Specifically, as founders, you're locked up for long periods of time in a market that essentially is extremely volatile. So your wealth is not liquid. Your wealth is essentially tied in paper that's going to be extremely volatile. I'd been personally for 7 years in JBoss. I'd been through a lot of ups and downs. I'd been through many rounds of Prozac medication to be able to go through the ups and downs. I'm serious. And I'm still recovering. And so, one of the things I did actually very early on in JBoss, and this is a recommendation I'll place for a lot of the entrepreneurs here, is if you already have some personal wealth, then you're all set. You're taking care of that basic animal instinct of I need to be protected. And when you're close to the goal and you don't have anything, it's very difficult to keep you cool. Right? And so my recommendation for those of you that don't have already some amount of personal financial protection is get some money off the table very early on with your VCs. That's something VCs don't like to do typically. It's a taboo, although less and less these days. But I strongly recommend that you consider participating as founders in your equity rounds, specifically the later equity rounds. And VCs nowadays are more open to this because obviously the argument is that with a little bit already in your back pocket, you can keep you cool when the big prize is coming around, as opposed to getting all nervous when the big prize gets closer. So I strongly encourage you to do that. So from a liquidity standpoint, obviously a sell depend, of course, on the negotiations. It's a sell you're doing. But depending on how you negotiate your sell, you can be fully liquid or close to fully liquid, or even if you're locked up with a valuation that is set in stone and not volatile and subject to your volatility. The second point is more systemic than personal, although please do not underestimate the personal aspect of these deal process. I'll come back to how stochastic really the sales process is. The second point is more systemic. It's as JBoss, we needed to invest. We'd grown a stage of the company about 160 people. Our competition is IBM, BEA, Oracle, Sun, all the little guys, and we had number one market share with our product. We needed to develop sales. We needed to develop marketing. Going public would have meant access to public capital that we couldn't really invest because of the way Wall Street values companies such as ours. This is depending on your own context, but in our case, we had a subscription-based business which drove valuation by cash flow, as I mentioned already. And because of that, any cash flow out, you have to have pretty sophisticated investors that can do discounted cash flow valuations and realize that $10 million invested now is worth $50 million in 3 years. Therefore, the present value is $15, and they give you credit for your investments. More often than not, they won't. In other words, you constrain yourself in your capacity to invest your own cash flow at our size. So if you're small, a public market, depending on your type of valuation, will limit, in fact, your capacity to